Welcome to another episode of the Apex Perspective podcast. Today, I get the pleasure to sit down with Partha Deka, who is currently the Principal AI Practice Architect at Tech Systems. Now, Partha, I know you started off in data engineering, and subsequently you got into a bit more of the agentic AI systems, specifically agentic AI architecture. But can I hear from your perspective? Tell me a little bit more about your background and how led you to what you're doing today.
Sure. First of all, thanks, Ariel, for
Mhm.
inviting me to your podcast. So, to give my background, I have been a data science and an AI engineer and an AI architect and an AI leader with over 16 years in the industry and then 3 years in a research setting as a research scientist. Over the period of last 16 years in various companies, I have been building production grade systems across, AI systems across semiconductor manufacturing, supply chain, and other enterprise AI. Over the past few years, my focus has been on agentic AI. As you could understand, it's evolving. It's pretty
Right.
new, right? And designing systems that can combine retrieval, reasoning, and action to solve real business problems. At various companies, I have led architecture and hands-on development of multi-agentic system.
Mhm.
Say, for example, for supply chain intelligence that reduces
Right.
cycle time from say multiple days to under an hour. Significantly improving decision accuracy.
Excellent. So I was curious, can we start with a little bit more about why you chose this particular path? I know that you started off in data engineering. Did you have an idea that you wanted to do this beforehand, or how did you choose that career path?
That's a very good question, right? When I was doing my master, back in those days, right, 2007 to 2009, I was
Mhm.
doing my master's in, electrical engineering, focusing on probability theory, discrete mathematics, advanced data mining, right? All the critical fundamental ML concepts, right? Back in those days, ML was not a coin, it was termed, or data science was not a coin, it was termed. It was
Correct.
basically some form of research going on in research lab. So I was part of those academic setting where I was doing um, research work, right? After my master's, I was doing my PhD. Also, I'm a PhD dropout. I didn't complete my PhD, but my PhD was focused on advanced data mining, probability theory, control systems, right? So I had the
Mhm.
background, and I started my career as a data engineer, but always had the interest and and academic background to apply my academic knowledge into something that I can into industry where I can solve industrial problems, right?
Certainly.
Hence, I started my career as a data engineer, and I think in about 2014-15 timeframe, I joined General Electric company as a data scientist, right, where my
Mhm.
actual real industrial ML, or you can say data science career started. Whereas begin to start statistical concepts and ML concepts to solve problems at scale.
Mhm.
And then that's how my journey started, right? Have worked for
Right.
Intel, and currently in a consulting role. Yeah, I have been applying different ML techniques like computer vision, natural language
Mhm.
processing, and recently agentic AI to solve industrial
Mhm.
problems.
And if I'm not wrong, about 5 years ago is when you got into learning more about the AI background or getting into AI specifically. So what was it that I know that they can go hand in hand sometimes, but AI specifically when it comes to advising and understanding the architecture itself, when did you go ahead and proceed with that particular route?
Yeah, that's a very good question. See, one of the biggest, I would say, uh, let's talk about applying AI in enterprises, right? One
Right.
of the biggest mistakes enterprises make is adopting AI because it is trending rather than because it solves a high value business problem, right?
Right.
In my experience, right, successful AI adoption should always start with business pain points, not with the model
Mhm.
itself, right?
Mhm.
Let's say, let's talk about LLM itself, right? My
Mhm.
approach is always usually a business first, then as AI second strategy.
Love it.
I
Love it.
begin by identifying workflows where there is either significant operational efficiency or high manual effort, large financial leakage, or slow decision making. Then I evaluate whether AI can meaningfully improve KPIs such as cost
Right.
savings or cycle time
Right.
reduction, accuracy, throughput, or customer experience, right? For example, in my experience at Intel in the semiconductor supply chain and logistics industry, I worked on
Mhm.
AI driven systems where the objective was not simply to use Gen AI, but to reduce
Mhm.
decision-making timelines, right? From
Mhm.
multiple days to reduce to under an hour, right? I combine, I use the combination of RAG pipelines and, multi-agent orchestration, vector databases, structured, enterprise data integration to achieve measurable business impact, right? And another important factor is enterprises' readiness, right? Many
Mhm.
companies underestimate the importance of governance,
Right.
security, access control, observability, and ROI tracking, right? A production grade AI system is not just an LLM connected to documents. It requires a proper architecture, authentication layers, right?
Mhm.
Evaluation frameworks, hallucination mitigation, monitoring, fallback mechanisms, human oversight, right? I strongly believe, right, enterprises should prioritize use cases where AI augments humans before replacing them,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Right. The highest value AI
Right.
systems are often co-pilot style systems that accelerate analysts, engineers, doctors, or financial professionals rather than fully
Right.
removing them from the workflow.
You identify the exact business outcome you want to have. You then reverse engineer how AI can be applied to its particular workflows. So that's actually a different approach to what you're seeing in a common situation where you can see a lot of organizations wanting to deploy AI and wanting to get that involved just because it is good to it's a good trend, of course, but to actually understand what kind of impact you want to create business wise in the company and then understand how AI can be applied is a matter that can actually maximize impact. Now, an important question for you is about AI transformation specifically. As you know, I think that if you look at the numbers behind digital transformations themselves, there's usually only a 33% success rate. And from my conversations with
Mhm.
other executives, it's because there's a failure to actually have the key stakeholders involved in that digital transformation. So when it comes to AI transformation specifically, where you have potentially individuals who are a bit more resistant to AI use, what do you think is going to happen to have a successful AI transformation, and what do you think the numbers will look like in that regard?
That's a very good question, right? You can hear a lot of news in social media news, right? You know, uh, you have 10% success rate or 20%, 30%, right? Let me talk about the framework that I follow, right?
Sure.
First of all, I would identify the measurable business pain points, right?
Hmm.
Understanding business is very important. Understanding the pain points of the business is important, right? What are the stakeholders are struggling with, right? Is it a
Hmm.
productivity issue? Is it we want to create more revenue? There is ROI leakage, right? Then
Hmm.
prioritize the high ROI workflows, right? Ensuring enterprise grade governance and security. It's very important, right? Then
Hmm.
start with augmentation before automation, right? Continuously evaluate outcomes using metrics like latency or accuracy,
Hmm.
groundedness, and eventually business KPIs, right? That is usually what separates AI hype from AI transformation, right? Which is
Hmm.
pretty critical, right? I'll give
Right.
you a concrete example, right? For some of the strengths and limitations of multi-agentic systems in sensitive industry, right? I believe multi-agentic systems are one of the most important evolutions, right, in enterprise
Hmm.
AI, as you could
Hmm.
understand, because
Hmm.
they allow decomposition of complex workflows into specialized reasoning units, right? Now, the
Right.
biggest strength is modular intelligence. Instead of one giant model trying to do everything, you can create specialized agents. For example, right, a
Right.
retrieval
Right.
agent retrieving data from various sources, a summarizing agent summarizing the data retrieved from various sources, a
With
compliance
specialized
checking
information.
agent, yeah, a reporting agent, and a validation agent, right? This creates better scalability, maintainability,
Hmm.
explainability, which is very important,
Hmm.
explainability,
Hmm.
and workflow orchestration, right? Yeah, in healthcare and
Right.
financial finance specifically, multi-agent systems can dramatically improve productivity. For example,
Hmm.
right, in healthcare, agents can assist with clinical documentation, right,
Hmm.
medical coding, patient summarization, claims analysis, right. In
Hmm.
finance, they can support fraud detection, compliance
Hmm.
workflows, right, portfolio analysis and contract intelligence, and so on and so forth.
Hmm. Right. So where are the limitations? Because if there is an intention to utilize AI at the enterprise level, you have to also understand where does it hit its limits. Perhaps it's creativity, perhaps it's a different type of skill sets in these workflows that can't be as easily done with AI. So where are the limitations and how do you identify what they are?
Yeah, I would say the first limitation is hallucination risk, right?
Okay.
In sensitive industries, even a small factual error can create
Exactly.
legal, financial, or patient safety consequences, right? The second
Mhm.
challenge is trust and explainability. So enterprises need to understand why a system produced a decision. You see, black box reasoning becomes difficult when multiple agents interact dynamically, right? So
Mhm.
third is your security and data governance, which is very important, right? Multi-agentic systems often communicate across tools, APIs, vector
Mhm.
databases, right? Enterprise
Mhm.
systems without proper role-based access control, authentication, and isolation mechanism. You can, unintentionally expose sensitive information, right?
Mhm.
Which is non-negotiable, right? Another issue is
Exactly.
orchestration complexity, right? As the number of agents grow, debugging and maintaining state consistency becomes difficult, right? You need strong
Right.
orchestration frameworks, telemetry, evaluation pipelines, right? Observability, right? That is why I believe human in the loop systems are still extremely important in sensitive industries. AI
Mhm.
should accelerate experts, but final high risk decisions should still involve qualified professionals, right? So I see
Exactly.
multi-agentic systems as incredibly powerful, but they must
Mhm.
be built with strong guardrails, observability, validation layers, and governance frameworks.
Especially if like you said, if it can accidentally make the wrong input or hallucination in a workflow that can actually cause harm to a patient in the medical industry, that's legal trouble. That can result in actual tangible issues. So that's where you're going to see
Exactly.
these limitations in requiring these guardrails where there's human oversight required. And that actually
Mm.
brings me to the other point that I was going to go over with you, which is actually understanding the involvement of domain specific skills. I think you mentioned a critical perspective just now. In order to actually deploy AI successfully and doing it properly, you first have to have the domain knowledge about business and understand the tangible business outcomes first, and then understand how AI can be applied. Now, a critical question to ask is where you see, let's just say in the next 3 to 4 years, where do you see, let's just say, AI being a bit more dominant in domain specific skill sets? Or what domain specific skills do you think will be more susceptible to AI in the next couple of years?
Oh, absolutely, right? Absolutely, right?
Mhm.
Domain knowledge is the key, right?
Mhm.
See, at the end of the day, it's a business workflow. You're trying to solve a business problem, right? And every
Mhm.
domain is complex, is critical. Understanding the
Mhm.
workflow, right? The processes to complete a process through a workflow is the key. And you're going to,
Mhm.
what you're doing, right? We are trying to enhance that experience with Agentic AI, correct?
Correct.
Or improve productivity, right?
Mhm.
Now, if we make flaws in that workflow, then it could lead to legal issues, right? Let's, as you talked
Exactly.
about, medical issues, right, or healthcare issues, or any flawed detection, of a disease or something, right? That will
Mhm.
create a lot of medical trouble, right? For example, in finance as well, right? If we do, flawed detection of some fraud or
Correct.
something, that might lead to legal issues. So yeah, of course, right? So enhancing AI with domain expertise is the key to
Okay.
really understand and realize the gains of agentic systems or AI systems as a whole.
Of course. Do you see any specific domain skill or workflow specifically? Let's just say in the way that AI is developing and its ability to reduce hallucinations as well. Do you see on the current trajectory on if there are certain skill sets that are more susceptible to being replaced by AI workflows?
You see, as I talked about, right, limiting hallucinations or you know uh, human in the loop AI, right?
Mhm.
AI can take a decision, but it should not take the final decision.
Okay.
Human in the loop AI is a must, right?
Mhm.
Uh, as I talked about, right, multi-agentic systems are powerful to automate your workflows, but they must be
Mhm.
built with strong guardrails, and that guardrails comes from domain knowledge, right?
Right. Exactly.
Validating continuously what the agentic AI is generating is the key, right?
Mhm.
And retrying till it generates guardrail output is very important. Meaning,
Mhm.
building a comprehensive governance architecture infused with
Mhm.
domain knowledge is the key for any
Mhm.
success of a AI project or an agentic AI project, right? For example, in
So
supply
yeah.
chain, understanding the supply chain network, right? You
Mhm,
know, understanding how things move, right? In terms of tariff or trade,
mhm,
right? It's the key, right?
mhm.
For example,
Right.
similarly with healthcare or financial workflows.
Right. So in other words, domain expertise is still going to be required because AI cannot make that final
100%,
decision.
100%,
Right.
100%.
Because AI cannot make that final decision, and that requires someone with actual domain knowledge. Now, the question for you is, do you think what's going to be left over in the next 4 or 5 years are primarily senior professionals, or let's just say C-suite professionals in these particular domain roles? Or do you think there still be a balance of entry level jobs being able to oversee these operations?
You see, that's a very good question. I think AI will significantly automate. Again, that's that's my perspective. I can be
Mhm.
absolutely wrong.
Sure.
I think AI has the potential to significantly automate portions of domain-specific workflows, but I do
Mhm.
not think most high-value professions will disappear. I don't think so.
Mhm.
Right? What will
Mhm.
happen is instead it will do a role transformation. For example, AI is extremely good at repetitive cognitive tasks, right? Pattern
Mhm.
recognition, summarization, document analysis, workflow orchestration, generating first drafts. So roles that
Mhm.
are highly repetitive and process driven are more susceptible to heavy automation. For example,
Mhm.
manually reporting workflows, repetitive customer support tasks, basic data processing, documentation heavy operations, standardized analytical workflows. In software engineering, right, AI can generate boilerplate code, assist
Yes.
debugging, right, create tests and accelerate development. In healthcare, AI can automate administrative overhead like clinical
Mhm.
summarization or claims processing. In finance, AI can automate large proportions of compliance review or document intelligence. However, the important distinction is that AI still struggles with deep strategic judgment, right?
Okay.
Ambiguity, right?
Right. Right.
Ethical reasoning, complex stakeholder management,
Mhm.
and contextual business decision making. Right? So I believe the future workforce will, increasingly consist of AI augmented professionals rather than
Right.
professionals fully replaced by AI. I absolutely don't believe
And
so.
yes, and I think the capacity is going to change over the next couple of years. I actually interviewed a principal engineer from Amazon recently, and even he's automating some of his work utilizing OpenClaw and some other coding tools, which is really interesting. And I think a principal engineer is one of the highest technical positions you can achieve in a company. So I think that's what's very interesting to me. Now, the last question I would have for you when it comes to building multi-agentic systems is really applying this at a enterprise level at scale specifically. As you know, I'm sure doing agentic AI at scale can open it up to certain cybersecurity risks due to the sheer scale of doing it and the way that agentic AI operates. What do you think is going to be required to actually successfully deploy at scale while limiting the cybersecurity risk?
Very good question, right?
Mhm.
I believe scaling, I mean, again, it's from my experience, scaling
Right.
AI, agentic AI is safely is one of the biggest enterprise challenges today, right? The
Mhm.
first principle is that security cannot be an afterthought, right? In enterprise AI systems, especially agentic systems, every agent interaction potentially becomes an attack surface, right? At
Mhm.
scale,
Exactly.
I believe organizations should focus on five major pillars, right? First is strong identity and access management.
Mhm.
Every agent should operate with role-based access control, least privilege principles. Agents should only access the data and tools necessary for their tasks. Second is secure orchestration architecture, right? Enterprise should use centralized gateways, authentication layers, API
Mhm.
governance, right? Audit logging, encrypted communication between agents and enterprise systems. Third is your retrieval governance. For example,
Mhm.
in a retrieval augmented generation system, right? Controlling data access at retrieval time is critical. Metadata
Mhm.
filtering, user scoping, region-based isolation, document level, permissions become extremely important. Fourth
Mhm.
is your, I already talked about it, right? Observability and evaluation, right?
Right.
Enterprises need production telemetry. monitoring
Mhm.
hallucination rates, right? Latency, unsafe outputs, right? Prompt
Yeah.
injection attempts, abnormal agent behaviors, and security anomalies, so forth and so forth, right?
Certainly.
Uh, at last, right? Creating a layered guardrail and validation is key.
Hmm.
Framework is key. I strongly believe enterprise AI systems should never rely on raw LLM outputs alone. We
Okay.
need structured validation,
Okay.
policy enforcement, grounding checks, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Excellent. So what I'll do now is go ahead and shift the conversation to a little bit more about you, Partha, and on the personal side. So the first question I have for you is, what is something about you or your life that you wish more people knew about?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question one more
Of
time?
course, of course. What is something about you or your life that you wish more people knew about?
Oh, that's an interesting question, right?
It's one of the
See,
hardest questions for most of my
yeah.
guests.
See, being an engineer or a AI engineer, a software engineer, however you want me to keep it,
Mhm.
uh, you know, maybe looking at my profile, folks might think, I'm a very technical person, very technical savvy, and try to build the most robust system, right?
Mhm.
But over the years of experience, what I have understood is understanding the goal of your work is very important, right? Why am I doing this, right?
Mhm.
I'm building this piece of application or a software to impact business.
Mhm.
Uh, so having a strong understanding of that,
The
start from the
why,
beginning is key, right? Why am I doing it, right?
right?
Right? Having a mental map, right? Hey, if I do these sequential steps, is it going to impact something, right? Is it going
Right.
to improve the productivity of my stakeholders, right? Is it going
Right.
to create revenue, right? Is it going to improve ROI, right? Is it going to remove the revenue leakage that is happening? That is hard lesson learned through my
Mhm.
years of working in the industry, right?
Yes.
And now when I approach any task or job, right, I always tend to connect the bigger picture from the
You have to, and
nitty gritty of the details.
I could not agree more, because I did a TED talk about 2 years ago about finding your why. And when you have a reason as to why you're doing something, and one that actually means a lot to you, the amount of work you're willing to put in is significantly more than the work you're willing to put in when you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. Especially if you know, if that why means a lot to you personally, the amount of lengths you're willing to go to as opposed to the other processes is far higher. I think that's a very critical point you made right there. Now, the other question I have for you is, what do you think is the biggest difference between you in your 20s and you now?
Interesting question, right? 20s, I would say, high on energy, right?
Hmm.
Hey, I can solve any problem, right? Uh, you know, Life is simple, right? Yeah, hey, it's a challenge, I'll go over it. But as you mature, right, you understand the perspective of what you're working on, right?
Hmm.
Perspective of your family, right?
Hmm.
It's not just work that is important, right? Family is also as
Agreed.
important as your work, right? Striking a balance, right? Between work and family, or of course maintaining good health, right?
Hmm.
Which I didn't care when I was 20, right? I was
Hmm.
eating junk food and all whatnot, right?
Hmm.
Then I realized, right, once you age, you are prone to disease, right? So to give you an example, right? I started training when I was 38, right? I never realized the importance of strength training, right? Before,
Hmm.
during my 20s, some of my friends used to go to the gym, and I didn't realize, I didn't bother, right? I used to go, for a walk or running, that's it.
Hmm.
Then I understood the importance of, building muscle, right? It's not just for your look and feel, but it's
Hmm.
necessary for longevity, right?
Correct.
It's necessary to build a good immune system
I agree.
inherently, right?
I
Fight
agree.
disease, right? So
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
So what I'll do now is go ahead and share a very concise perspective on fitness and health from my perspective, and we'll go ahead and conclude the podcast with your plans for this year.
Sure,
So the
sure,
main
sure.
perspective I actually want to provide today is really about how to make it time efficient. As you know, Partha, a lot of my viewers are entrepreneurs and executives, so I want to make this as relevant as possible. The biggest issue by far I can see here is following an approach that you can do on a long-term basis. And what I mean by that is something that is hard to adhere to for someone who is taking calls daily or potentially is traveling. And something that's hard to follow is usually a location dependent approach. If your main approach is one that is dependent on going to a gym or studio for you to make a physical transformation and you can't adhere to that, the problem with that is there's going to be days where you're going to miss it because you're taking calls or potentially traveling. And on a long-term scale, if you're not adhering to the requirements of making a transformation, of course, you're not going to get the end goal. So the idea is restructure to become far more adaptable to your schedule as opposed to you making time for it, because the location dependent approach requires you to make time for it. So the idea is if you can create a location independent approach, something you can do anytime, anywhere, as opposed to one fixed location, your capacity to actually adhere to the requirements is far greater, and you're probably going to be having a much higher likelihood of achieving that end goal of yours. So what I specifically recommend, particularly for fat loss, I would say, is leveraging something like step count, because step count is something you can do while you're listening to this podcast. It's something you can do while you're traveling, and anywhere in the world there's ground underneath you, which I should believe at least 99% of the time that's the case. You should be able to adhere to that process. And of course, there's a specific amount you have to do, but the idea is that it's adapted to your schedule, what you're doing. And you can multitask with it, and that's going to be far more adaptive than the other approaches. And this is exactly what I used to lose over 70 pounds and keep it off. So hopefully it gives a different perspective to what potentially is sold traditionally, but hopefully it was viable. What we'll do now is go ahead and move the conversation to part of this plans for this year, whether that be professionally or personally. So tell me a little bit more about your plans for this year, Partha.
Oh yeah, I mean, thank you so much for sharing your journey. Right, it's amazing. It's an amazing
Thank you.
fit, you know. And alluding to that, right? You talked about how can you manage your schedule so that you can adhere to your schedule, right?
Mhm.
I'll give an example. I used to have membership in the gym. I used to go to the gym. It took me, and it's an episode, right? I have to plan. I have family. I have to
Take a
plan
shower and
1 hour
everything.
ahead. Take a shower, whatnot. It used to take me 3 hours now. And time went by. Then I realized, why can't I build my mini gym in my garage? So over the period of last 6 months, I built my mini gym in my garage, and I hit the gym whenever I have time. So 30
Nice.
minutes, that's it. I don't have
Nice.
to prepare for it. I don't have to drive my car to the gym, take a shower and get out of it. It takes me 3 hours. Now I can do it in 45 minutes. That's very productive and efficient, and I can do it anytime. Right.
Agreed.
So yeah, it completely allude to what you said, right?
Love
Building
it.
your own rhythm and what works for you,
Correct.
improving your productivity, right?
Yes. Excellent. Well, Partha, it's been a pleasure to have you on. I really appreciate your perspectives today on AI. I think it's a different one where you're not seeing what's basically just the hot topic behind it, but rather what's an actual effective strategy behind deploying AI. I think those are very important perspectives you provided today. So I appreciate you for coming on and sharing those perspectives. This was Aryan Mohindra and Partha Deka. Thank you for listening.